The incessant hum. God, the hum. I still heard it when I closed my eyes, a persistent echo in my eardrums like a tiny chainsaw relentlessly running inside my head. All the time. I'd been neck-deep in the complex society of Apis mellifera bees. For 8 months, and the initial fascination, the one that drove me to create a dedicated seedbed for studying those golden creatures in their striped suits, had transformed into a kind of mental exhaustion bordering on aversion. Every day was a journey under the microscope, a millimeter-by-millimeter analysis of waggle dances, of pheromones dictating entire lives, of the relentless efficiency of a beehive that before seemed like a miracle of nature, and now it was a coordinated nightmare. My fingers still felt the sticky residue of honey and propolis, even after hours of scrubbing. The sweet scent, once comforting, had become cloying, almost nauseating. The sight of thousands of tiny bodies moving in unison, each with a specific function, each sacrificing its individuality for the hive, sent shivers down my spine. I no longer saw the wonder of symbiosis. I saw a pulsating mass, a relentless, hive mind that had absorbed me and spat me out, exhausted. I needed air. I needed to see something bigger than a stinger, something that wouldn't make me feel like an intruder in a world I'd dissected to death. Especially after what happened. During my thesis work, when I started to imagine, or not, I don't know anymore, to have illusions or hallucinations related to the bees. The day I announced my decision to leave bee research, the faces of my lab colleagues were priceless. I remember the look of disbelief from Dr. Elena, my supervisor, who had encouraged me to pursue the Hymenoptera research line during my thesis. "But Laura," she had said with a hint of disappointment in her normally serene voice, "you're so good at this. Are you sure it's not just burnout?" I nodded, my brain already disconnected from images of hives and flight patterns. I'd saved enough, for a couple of months, to afford the luxury of floating, of looking for a sign, anything that didn't involve buzzing and the stickiness of wax. Weeks of strange calm followed, rereading books that weren't about ethology, walking through parks, without obsessively checking flowers for pollinators. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, my phone vibrated with a call from Clara, a university colleague who now worked in Elena's lab. Her voice, always energetic, sounded charged with excitement. "I've got incredible news for you. Remember Dr. Samuel Vargas, the large mammal guy from Tristram University? Well, he called me asking for someone in the field with good experience in behavioral observation, and I recommended you. He needs help with something huge." My pulse quickened. Vargas was a legend in the world of field biology, an expert in Andean fauna. We arranged a video call for the next day. I logged on with a mix of nervousness and a curiosity I hadn't felt in months. Dr. Vargas's face appeared on screen, framed by the clutter of what seemed to be his office, with topographical apps and stacked books. "Thanks for taking my call. Clara spoke very highly of you, of your eye for detail and your patience in observations. I need that, and much more, for a project that's keeping us all awake at night." He told me the details. A recently discovered deer species, Hippocamelus australis, better known as the South American deer, had been sighted in a remote area of Chilean Patagonia, specifically in the fjords and channels of Asen, within the Magellanic subpolar forest ecoregion. "We'd never had reports of a Hippocamelus species so large and in such an unexplored area by humans," he explained. "It's a puzzle, not just because of its size, but because of how elusive they are. It seems they've found a perfect refuge among the mist, constant rain, and dense vegetation, where no one had looked before." The project involved an intensive phase of field observation to understand the ecology and behavior of this new population. They wanted to know when their mating season began, how their courtship was, if they had any, the dynamics of interspecific competition among males for reproduction and territory, female behavior during estrus, the gestation period, and if there was any parental care of the offspring. In short, everything a field biologist dreams of unraveling about a species untouched by science. I was fascinated. Fieldwork, nature, immersion in something completely new and tangible, far from the glass, cell of insects. It was the perfect opportunity. Although my experience with large mammals was limited, Dr. Vargas assured me I'd have time to review the preliminary material they had managed to collect: blurry photographs, vocalization recordings, and some trails, camera data. He also encouraged me to familiarize myself on my own with the dynamics of other deer species in the region, such as the pudu, pudu puda, or the southern huemul, Hippocamelus basulcus, to have a comparative basis. I would need a frame of reference, a normal that would allow me to identify the unusual. I accepted without hesitation. The bee-induced exhaustion still weighed on me, but the prospect of delving into a subpolar forest, tracking a ghost deer, and unraveling its secrets was the perfect antidote. With the contract signed and enthusiasm eroding my last reserves of bee aversion, I immersed myself in the vast bibliography on cervids. My goal was clear: build a foundation of normality so that any deviation in the behavior of the South American deer would stand out. The following weeks passed among scientific articles, documentary videos, and dusty monographs, familiarizing myself with the world of Patagonian deer. I learned about the southern huemul, the region's most emblematic native deer. They are medium-sized animals, with dense fur ranging from brown to gray, perfectly adapted to the cold and humidity. They are primarily diurnal, though sometimes seen at dawn and dusk. Their diet is varied, including shrubs, lichens, and grasses. They usually live in small family groups or solitarily, making each sighting precious. Dominance displays in males during rutting season are fascinating. Deep growls, the clashing of their antlers in ritualized combat that rarely ends in serious injury, rather in a display of strength and endurance. Dominant males mark their territory by rubbing their antlers against trees and releasing pheromones. Females, for their part, observe and choose the male who proves to be the strongest and most suitable for reproduction, a process that seems more like a power parade than an intimate courtship. Parental care, while it exists, is relatively brief, with offspring following the mother for a few months before becoming more independent. Everything about them radiated the brutal but predictable logic of survival. But then, I moved on to Dr. Vargas's folders on the Hippocamelus australis, the South American deer, the new species. The photos were blurry, grainy, taken from a distance by trail cameras or with high-powered telephoto lenses. Still, the difference was striking. Most of the captured specimens were significantly larger than any known huemul, almost double in some cases with more robust musculature. Their fur, instead of the typical brownish or grayish tone, appeared a deep jet black, almost absorbent, making them disappear into the gloom of the cloud forest. Others, however, appeared a ghostly pale white, almost translucent. Two fur tones, by age perhaps. A type of sexual dimorphism between males and females? The male's antlers were thicker and had stranger ramifications than those of common huemuls. The eye. Trail camera recordings, though sparse, were the most unsettling. They didn't show typical cervid movement patterns. There was no light trot, no nervous flight upon detecting the sensor. Instead, there were slow, deliberate, almost paused movements, as if they were inspecting the surroundings with unusual curiosity. In one sequence, a dark-furred specimen remained completely motionless in front of the camera for several minutes, head held high, eyes, two bright points in the darkness, fixed on the lens. In another, a group of 4 individuals, 1 black and 3 white, moved in a strange, almost linear formation, instead of the typical dispersion of a herd. There was no grazing, no evidence of feeding, just movement and observation. My ethological normal began to waver even before I set foot in Patagonia. These creatures, with their anomalous size and extreme bicolor fur, were already a contradiction to the norms of their own group. But the strangest things were those images, those flashes of something, distinct in their eyes, in their movements. A stillness too conscious, an organization too deliberate. But well, at that time, it was a newly discovered group, and in nature, there will always be some group that doesn't follow the norm. The departure was a blur of logistics and nervousness. The bee-induced exhaustion was still a backdrop, but the excitement of the unknown pushed it into the background. My team, composed of 2 field biologists with mammal experience, though unfamiliar with Huemules, joined me. Andres, a young and enthusiastic ethologist, and Sofia, an experienced Chilean, botanist with an encyclopedic knowledge of local flora and a keen eye for detail. We met at the Santiago airport, exchanging tired smiles and suitcases packed with technical gear and thermal clothing. The flight to Khoi Hake and then the endless drive along gravel roads, winding through dense vegetation and fjords, was a gradual immersion into the isolation we would be submerged in for the next few months. The research center was nothing more than a handful of rustic wooden cabins, precariously nestled between the dark green of the trees and the dull gray of the mountains. The fine, persistent rain was a constant welcome, enveloping everything in an ethereal mist that gave the landscape a spectral air. The air smelled of wet earth, moss, and the cold dampness of wood. The silence was profound, broken only by the incessant dripping and the whisper of the wind through the coigus and arayanes. There was no trace of civilization beyond a couple of fishing boats anchored at a small makeshift dock. We were, truly, at the end of the world. The first week was a frantic dance of acclimatization and planning. With the help of a couple of local guides, men of few words but with eyes that seemed to have seen every tree and every stream, we conducted an initial reconnaissance of the total area assigned for the research. The terrain was challenging, almost. Non-existent trails, steep slopes, treacherous bogs, and vegetation so dense that sunlight barely filtered to the ground. We consulted topographic maps marking key points, possible animal movement routes, water sources, refuge areas, and potential elevated observation points. We decided to divide the area into 3 work fronts, each covering a specific sector to maximize our chances of sighting and monitoring. The idea was to rotate observation areas every few days to keep the perspective fresh and reduce impact. The most important task of that first week was the strategic distribution of trail cameras. We walked kilometers, carrying the equipment, and attaching it to robust trees. We wanted to capture any movement. We calibrated the motion sensors for medium-large detection, not for small animals. We knew that the South American deer were substantially larger than common Huemules, and the idea was to focus on them. We didn't want thousands of photos of rabbits or foxes. It was a measure to optimize storage and review time, but also, implicitly, to focus on the anomaly we expected to find. At dusk, back in the cabins, the only light came from a wood-burning stove and a couple of gas lamps. As the rain hammered on the roof, we reviewed coordinates, discussed the best access routes for the coming days, and shared our first impressions of the forest. Andres was fascinated by the abundance of lichens, Sophia by the native orchids, timidly peeking out from the moss, and I felt the weight of the silence, the immensity of an untouched place that held secrets. We hadn't seen a single South American deer in person yet, but the feeling that we were treading on different ground, a place where the unusual was the norm, was already beginning to settle in. The second week marked the formal start of our field operations. We had divided the terrain, with Andres covering the western sector, an area of deep valleys and dense thickets, ideal for camouflage. Sophia took charge of the east, characterized by its gentler slopes and proximity to a couple of small streams that flowed into the fjord. I was assigned the central zone, a labyrinth of primary, dense, and ancient forest, dotted with rock outcrops and small wetlands. Communication between us was limited to satellite radios which, despite their reliability, often cut out with the capricious Patagonian weather, forcing us to rely on daily meeting points and the good faith that everyone followed. Their protocols. The first week of observation was, to put it mildly, frustrating. We tracked, we waited, we blended into the landscape, but the South American deer, Hippocamelus australis, seemed like ghosts. We saw everything else: curious foxes, flocks of birds, even a poodoo that scurried through the undergrowth. Everything, except the deer for which we had traveled thousands of kilometers. It was normal. Large, elusive animals require patience. Even so, the disappointment was palpable in Andres's and Sophia's eyes at the end of each day. Physical exhaustion was constant, a cold dampness that seeped into your bones, and the frustration of searching for something that wouldn't show itself. The following weeks established a routine. Mornings of exploration, observation, and trail. Camera maintenance, afternoons of data recording, and nights of planning. We rotated fronts every 7 days, which allowed all three of us to familiarize ourselves with the entire study area. We learned to navigate the treacherous terrain, to interpret the subtle signs of the forest. By the 4th week, our eyes were sharper, finely tuned to detect not only fresh tracks, but also patterns of broken branches, unusual marks on tree bark, or even a faint, earthy, sweet smell that sometimes mingled with the scent of moss and rain. It was during my turn on the central front, early that 4th week, when something broke the monotony. It wasn't a sighting, but a sound. I was checking a trail camera, the light rain drumming on my jacket hood, when I heard it. A deep, resonant vocalization, different from any deer bellow I had ever studied. It wasn't a roar, nor a mournful cry, but something more akin to a deep, almost human moan, albeit distorted, as if coming from a throat not meant to produce such sounds. It repeated 3 times, spaced by tense silences. It wasn't close. The echo suggested it came from the depths of the valley, beyond the area we had extensively mapped. I recorded what little I could with my handheld recorder and sent the audio to Andres and Sophia via radio that same night. The feedback was immediate. Both were as bewildered as I was. "It sounds wrong," Andres commented, his voice unusually sober. Sophia suggested it might be a reverberation phenomenon or some other species, but the guttural melody of that sound had stuck with me, and I knew it wasn't the echo of a puma or the lowing of a distant cow. Upon reviewing the recording time, a chill ran down my spine. The sound had occurred right at twilight, a time not very common for large cervid activity, which tends to be diurnal or more nocturnal in the late hours of the night. I mentioned it to my companions. I want to camp there, or at least be present, right at dusk. Maybe then I can get a sighting, an indication of what on earth produces that sound. It's too risky to go alone. The deeper zones can be unpredictable, Andres told me. We can't abandon our fronts now. The Wemmel distribution is extensive, and if they start moving, we could lose weeks of work, Sophia replied. They understood, but they couldn't risk the monitoring. I insisted, the urgency growing within me, so I decided to ask one of the local guides for help. The man, with a weathered face and eyes that always seemed distant, listened to me with his usual silence, until I finished. Then his response was a resounding and surprising no. His refusal wasn't due to laziness, it was a categorical denial. He looked at me with an inscrutable expression, a mix of warning and fear. "It's reckless, miss. There are things you don't look for in the darkness of that forest." His refusal was so sudden and suspicious that it chilled me, but I couldn't force him. It wasn't his obligation to risk his life for my scientific intuitions. I knew that what I was about to do was a risk, a violation of safety protocols. But curiosity, the longing to unravel that mystery stirring in the depths of the forest, was stronger than caution. The recording of that guttural moan echoed in my mind. I had to go. My backpack felt heavy, but it was a welcome burden compared to the mental weight of the bees. I advanced with determination toward the section of the central front where I had recorded that sound. The ascent was slow, the humidity and moss making every step slippery. I reached the point I had marked on the GPS just as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky with oranges and purples through the dense tree canopy. The air grew colder, and the silence deeper. I set up my small camouflage tent as discreetly as possible among the foliage and lit a tiny campfire to warm a portion of food. I watched the sunset, every shadow lengthening and shifting. The forest grew dark. Hours passed, and the only signs of life were the bats that began to zigzag in the twilight sky and the myriads of insects that relentlessly swarmed towards the light of my headlamp. Frustration began to take hold. Nothing, not a single sighting, of the South American deer. The moan that had drawn me there did not repeat. My spirits fell. Perhaps my hunch was just the desperate desire of an exhausted biologist to find something out of the ordinary. It was already late at night, and the cold was beginning to seep in. I decided to end the vigil and get into the tent. If they were nocturnal, they would have to be so in the deepest hours of the night, and my goal was only to confirm the possibility, not to freeze in the attempt. I crawled into the tent, adjusted my sleeping bag, and closed my eyes, exhaustion claiming its toll. Just as consciousness began to fade, a sound startled me. It was the moan, that deep, resonant vocalization, identical to the one I had recorded, that had brought me here. Had I dreamed it? Half asleep, I opened my eyes, my heart racing. I thought it was the echo of my own subconscious desire, manifesting in a vivid dream. I sat up, turned on my flashlight, and poked my head out of the tent zipper. The night was dark and silent. The flames of my campfire, reduced to embers, cast a faint, dancing light on the nearby trees. There was nothing, only shadows and the wind whispering through the leaves. With a sigh of resignation, I re-entered the tent, convinced it had been an illusion. I was about to fall asleep again when a presence enveloped me. It wasn't a sound, but a feeling of being watched. My skin crawled. It was outside. A large animal, no doubt. But the flickering light from the campfire embers, casting shadows on one side of my tent, formed a silhouette, and it wasn't that of a deer, nor a puma. It was tall and upright, unmistakably human. Had someone managed to reach this inaccessible place? Other researchers? Poachers? The silhouette moved, and an icy chill ran down my spine. The figure sat down in my folding chair, which I had left by the campfire. Then, I heard the subtle rustle of leaves and broken branches. Another person was walking around my tent, slowly. Circling me, I was trapped. 2 intruders, perhaps more. My knife, a modest multi-tool, felt ridiculous in my trembling hand. I had a roll of survival rope, but what good would it be? Fear tightened my throat. My mind raced, searching for a plan, as the sound of cautious footsteps approached the entrance to my tent. One of the figures stopped in front of the zipper, darkness engulfing its form, but I felt its proximity, its breath. And then, I heard a sniff, an unmistakable animal sound, rhythmic and wet, just on the other side of the fabric. It wasn't a dog's sniff, it was something deeper, more intense. A person doing that? I remained mute, frozen, my heart pounding against my ribs. Suddenly, the figures moved away, not running but retreating with movements that, even in the dim light, seemed strangely coordinated and silent. I took advantage of the distance to peek out of the zipper, flashlight in hand, looking for a clearer view. The faint light of the campfire still glowed, and against the deep darkness of the forest, I saw their silhouettes. They were tall, slender, but when one of them turned slightly, the campfire light hit the outline of its head, and I saw with horror some ears, not human, but animal, moving. Large and pointed, they twitched, the same movement a dog or a deer makes to catch a sound. It was impossible. My eyes tried to register the shape of their bodies, which were longer than normal, their limbs too skeletal. I understood nothing. Terror overwhelmed me. Instinctively, driven by an irrational panic, I started to make noise. I stomped on the tent floor, shuffled my feet, banged on the tent fabric. A part of me believed the noise would scare them away, that the surprise of a confrontation would make them retreat. And it worked. I heard footsteps rapidly moving away, but there weren't 2. There were 4, perhaps 5 or more, a trail of quick movements that vanished into the depths of the forest. I poked my head out of the tent, shining my flashlight. The light cut through the darkness, but only revealed the disturbance of bushes, and branches swaying as if something large and fast had passed through. No way was I going to follow them. What were they? Humans? Animals? The hours until dawn loomed over me like an eternity. I stayed in the tent, flashlight on, knife firmly gripped, praying nothing else would happen that night. The Patagonian cold had never felt so absolute. The Night stretched on, a silent, cold torture. Every rustle in the forest, every raindrop falling on the tent, was magnified in the terrifying silence. My mind replayed the image of those tall silhouettes, the twitching ears, the animal sniff, over and over. What on earth had I witnessed? At that moment, I didn't know if I was going crazy or if I didn't know what we would have to live through that very week. Enjoy another story. I had been sleeping poorly. For weeks, perhaps since the house became empty, and human voices vanished from its hallways. But that night was different. I dreamt something I haven't been able to forget, even though I've tried with methods more rational than poetic. Something that clung to my body like a pungent smell, like a subcutaneous hum. In the dream, I was part of a hive. I wasn't observing. The bees. I was one of them. But not like a human disguised as an insect, not with fake antennae or an anthropomorphized body. I was a bee in its entirety, its sensory field, its exoskeleton, its consciousness divided between individual will and collective impulse. Everything vibrated, everything smelled, everything moved in patterns I understood without comprehending. The hive wasn't a common honeycomb. It didn't hang from a branch or hide in a natural cavity. It was organic, yes, but also in another way. The hexagons seemed to pulse, moist, as if they were breathing. They opened and closed with a cadence reminiscent of an animal's diaphragm while asleep. The walls were covered with a warm, gelatinous substance that wasn't wax or honey, but something like flesh. And the worst, the sound. A choral hum, like thousands of thoughts stitched together, but suddenly distorted, as if something or someone was trying to speak through it. They weren't words. It felt more like an intention, a presence using the hum as a mouth. I tried to move, to fly, but the wings didn't obey. I felt a larva inside me, not literally, but as if I were incubating something, as if that hive didn't contain me but was forming me from within. Then something changed. I began to understand the pattern of the hum, as if the pheromones crossing the air were also syntax, the language of the swarm. And what they said, what they repeated over and over, was a question directed toward a specific cell of the hive that didn't seem made to contain honey or a larva. It was a different cell, covered with black wax, as if it were charred. The other bees avoided it, but I didn't. I was drawn to it, as if it were mine, as if it belonged to me. I felt it was mine. I crawled over the surface of the honeycomb, and when I touched that cell, the hum ceased, and I heard a word, a single one. Not a name, not a verb. A word that in the dream was perfectly understandable, although now only its resonance remains, like a wet silhouette on a fogged mirror. I woke up drenched in sweat, my mouth dry, my nails dug into the palms of my hands. An invisible hum lingered behind my ears like the echo of something that doesn't belong to the dream or wakefulness. I didn't remember that word, but everything else was fresh in my memory. I could recount it perfectly, as I am doing now. The only thing I didn't remember and still don't is that word. I shook myself a bit before getting out of bed. That had been the strangest and craziest dream I'd ever had. Well, a dream I remembered. At that time, I was a biology student about to finish my degree. Only the graduation requirement remained. I had decided to work on a thesis instead of doing an internship. Why? I don't even know. If I had taken the other option, maybe none of what happened afterward would have occurred, and I wouldn't have ended up medicated. My thesis focused on the sensory allometry of Apis mellifera, the honeybees. Hence the reason for that dream. It's not that in the realm of Morpheus I had become an expert on bees. I was fascinated by the precision of their bodies, the way the growth of their sensory organs relates to body size. Everything could be measured, graphed, understood. I suppose I was attracted to precision itself. I lived in an old university house in a city I prefer not to name. The walls were always damp and smelled of old books. Before the 2020 pandemic, 8 students lived there, each in their room sharing coffee, insomnia, laughter, and existential crises. But when the quarantine began, everyone returned to their homes. Everyone had a place to go back to, except me. I stayed alone, 6 months locked in that house, surviving on delivery food and sporadic video calls. At first, solitude was a luxury. Not having to share the kitchen, the bathroom, the laundry, not hearing doors closing or other people's footsteps. But over time, the silence mutated. It became thick, like a substance. I spoke with my advisor once a week. Sometimes I exchanged messages with Alejandra, a friend from my program who was also writing from her city, with her parents, with other humans, unlike me. The rest was silence, hums, and the sound old things make when they think no one is listening. There, amid routine and isolation, the boundary between the real and the other began to blur. It all started with a file. One morning, while reviewing a fragment of the morphometric analysis of Apis mellifera worker bees, I noticed a sentence I didn't remember writing. Compound eyes are an architecture of surveillance. Each segment watches, records, and remembers. I deleted it, assuming I had copied it by mistake from some neuroethology article. But the next day, there was another new sentence. The queen watches even when she sleeps. I decided to change. The file's password made a copy on a USB and another in the cloud. I started reviewing the change history. Clearly, no one else had accessed the computer. I repeat, I was alone. I simply attributed everything to fatigue, loneliness, the pandemic, and the latent stress of dying and still having to pretend normality and continue with our lives. Continue working on a thesis to graduate and have opportunities in a future I didn't know if it would come. However, things didn't adopt a tone of sanity, despite being aware of the probable alteration of reality that my mind might be suffering. One day, a jar of honey appeared on the kitchen table. It had no label and I hadn't ordered it. At least I didn't remember buying it. I wasn't a honey enthusiast. Sometimes I used it to sweeten the teas I drank, but now I lived 80% thanks to coffee, so it wasn't possible that I had made that purchase. The honey had a darker color than commercial honey and a slightly metallic smell. I decided to try it. Maybe it was a jar of the honey we had extracted in the lab, the one that had been gifted to the university's administrative staff and deans. Its taste was strange, like old wood. It wasn't pleasant, and I didn't know where it came from. Maybe one of the guys who lived with me had forgotten it, so I threw the jar away, but it reappeared. I remembered wrapping the jar in paper towels and throwing it in the trash can. However, the next morning, that jar was intact on the kitchen counter again. I wrote to Alejandra to tell her what was happening to me. I had already told her about the sentences I didn't remember writing, and she, like me, attributed it to stress, but this? Alejandra, worried about my increasingly erratic messages, offered to come visit me, and I accepted with relief. She had a special permit to move around the city since she, along with other microbiologists, was working in the university's laboratories with samples from people infected with the pandemic disease to determine if there was contagion or not. It was an offer made by our university due to the pandemic status the disease had reached worldwide. When she arrived, she hugged me as if I had been sick. "When was the last time you went out to the garden?" she asked me. "A week ago," I replied. But when we opened the back door, we found a completely different garden, darker, with trees I didn't recognize, as if they had aged decades in a few months. That garden was completely neglected. Even when there were more people, there were only weeds acting as yellowish grass, seedlings that wouldn't get far, and even 2 trees that hadn't changed much in the time I'd been living in that house, and that had been almost 5 years. I didn't say anything. Not because what I was seeing or feeling was a lie, but because Alejandra didn't. She knew that house. We had gone many times to hang out there, to drink, to read. She had even brought her dog Haru. If she didn't notice any difference, then what was happening to me? Damn stress. The last night, while Alejandra slept in my room, I went down to the improvised lab I had set up in the old library. The bees were restless as their hum was more intense and at the same time more harmonious. When I approached the aquarium that was supposed to be a hive, I saw that with their bodies they had formed a precise figure, an incomplete hexagon, the same one that had appeared in the thesis, in my dreams. Then something crossed my mind, that maybe there was no difference between my study, my thoughts, and the hive. In my mind, there was a certainty, A certainty that something had opened. Something was using me to write. That's why random sentences I didn't remember thinking or writing, appeared in my documents, in my thesis draft. It had to be that. The truth is, I'm not sure if that's what really happened. Maybe it was all a symptom of confinement, of loneliness. Maybe it still is. Over time, the confinement ended. Not overnight, of course, but the authorities relaxed the measures. The university reopened gradually, and some voices returned to the hallways. Alejandra returned to the city. We saw each other one afternoon, in silence after months of out of sync, messages and video calls with poor connection. She asked me if I was okay, and I said yes. We both knew it was a lie, but neither wanted to correct the other. The thesis was submitted. I remember the strange weight of having it printed in my hands. Sensory allometry in Apis mellifera during early larval development and its possible relation to caste differentiation. A technical, clean, neat title. Nothing in that title alluded to the vertigo I felt while writing it, nor to the paranoia that grew like mold between the folds of confinement. The defense was virtual. They congratulated me, and I remember one of the jurors used the word solid. Everything was solid, firm, scientific, rational. And yet, when I hung up the call, I felt a cold shiver down my back, as if someone had been listening from another room, like that feeling of being watched. Days later, one morning without dates or sense, I couldn't get out of bed. I spent nearly 2 weeks shut in again, this time without a pandemic, without a thesis, without excuses. It was Alejandra who found me and took me to the hospital. I was diagnosed with mixed anxiety-depressive disorder. The psychiatrist explained everything with professional calm. Prolonged isolation, academic stress, sleep deprivation, possible genetic predisposition. She prescribed anxiolytics, antidepressants, and a mild hypnotic to help me sleep. Since then, that chemical combination has been with me. Some days I forget who I was before. Other days I prefer not to remember. I never worked with bees again. I tried a couple of times at the beginning. I visited an apiary with a colleague, more out of politeness than genuine interest. But the buzzing. That buzzing. Not the one from real bees, but the other one, lower, more intimate. The one that doesn't travel through the air but inside the skull. That one is still there. I gave up the experiments. I left sensory entomology. I requested a transfer. Now I teach molecular and cell biology at the same university. The students listen attentively, and some even ask why I never talk about hymenopterans, bees, wasps, ants, since it's the field I graduated from. I just smile and change the subject. Sometimes, not always, but on some nights, when sleep evades me even with the help of the pills, the buzzing returns. Not as an actual sound, more like a presence, a mental frequency. It's there when silence is absolute, when my breathing sounds louder than it should, when the darkness feels thicker than usual. And then I remember, the living hive, the cell, sealed with black wax, the buzzing that spoke, the buzzing with a mouth. Sometimes I think I hear that shapeless word again, the one revealed to me in dreams and forgotten upon waking. Or maybe I didn't forget it. Maybe I'm just incubating it. Thanks for diving into this story with me. Don't miss out on the next one. Hit that subscribe button, give this video a big thumbs up, and drop a comment below with your thoughts. I'd love to hear what you think.